feeling like an outsider in this world and like we didn't belong anywhere.
T21 Alchemy, yeah. T21 Alchemy, it's a T21 Alchemy. T21 Alchemy, it's a T21 Alchemy.
Welcome to T21 Alchemy podcast, and I am your host, Oneness Sankara. This podcast grew out of my lived experience and my personal journey as a mother to a phenomenal child with T21 and the creative journey of turning this life into a play. Each episode sits at the intersection of lived experience, creativity, and advocacy, exploring disability, parenting, inclusion through real stories and conversation. By now, you've heard T21 Alchemy, T21 Alchemy. But what actually is this play about? This play is about a mother, an African, Caribbean, British mother, navigating her world whilst raising a child with T21, aka Down syndrome. I felt like, obviously, there are commonalities between me and the protagonist of this story, right? Because it's based on inspired by my lived experience primarily. And I felt like this story was bigger than what was going on in my home. And one of the big things that we felt as a family was isolation. And I started to realize that if I was feeling that isolation, so were other people. And why were we feeling that? And it was that we didn't tend to see any representation of this world that we're in. And so therefore it just felt really unknown. Throughout my experience, even before actually giving birth and having a diagnosis for my child, I'd make little notes, and I knew that there was something that I was being asked to talk about through my lived experience, but it wasn't fully clear. And because of the early part of my personal journey, which was about me, my child, my family, like survival, really, surviving medical access, this new world, it wasn't the time then. And we got to a point where my child became a bit bigger and a bit more robust. And it felt like it was the right time to tell the story. So I say the right time to tell the story. Before I started telling this story, when it was coming together, it was poetic notes. I'd write little bits of poetry, couple lines here, like something would happen and I'd just make a note of it and I'd write a couple of lines and I'd leave it, and I really didn't think about it. I really didn't think about it much after that point. And when I decided that I was going to create this into a piece of art, into a play, I said, okay, let me look at what I've noted down. And that was like step number one. There were moments that kept on repeating itself, like conversations that I would have with other mothers and other parents, that we were having the same similar experiences. And one of those experiences was not being heard and not being understood. And so I felt like that was across the board for like parents of children with T21, as well as like parents with children with other SEND needs, right? This thing of people not understanding our situation and being judged, and challenges with medical and school. Like there were just reoccurring themes that I was like, this is not just a me and my family thing. What I noticed through my lived experience was feeling like an outsider in this world, feeling like that myself and feeling like that for my son, like we didn't belong anywhere. You know, we were in this intersectional place, being a Black family, navigating the world of disability, etc. But it felt like nowhere was designed for us and our experience in mind. I was carrying a lot of emotions that I had to kind of swallow and keep tucked away somewhere because we had to get on with surviving, and I felt like I had to be strong for my son and for my family. So the feelings of just like exhaustion, like not just physical exhaustion, yes, there's that, but mental exhaustion of having to hold it all together and be all of these different roles and learn all of these new things were some of the emotions that I knew would go somewhere. I had these thoughts, these feelings, these ideas. And why, to me, it was a play, because a lot of it at the time felt surreal. It felt like scenes. It felt like if people could see these scenes, they might understand more. And of course, like doing a blog or standing up and doing a talk is an opportunity to share a different perspective and what's going on. But theatre and scripts and storytelling is magical because it allows you to put yourself in someone else's shoes. It allows you to see what they see or feel what that character feels when nobody's there. And also, there's something that's very specific about theatre and about live work and people being in a space together and having a collective experience, even though they're having their own individual experience, right? But that to me felt really important and powerful because one of the words that have kept coming up in this story, in my story, and in stories of other parents and carers that I've spoken to is the word isolation. And so there felt like there was something powerful about people having this collective experience. And that wouldn't be possible in the same time space reality in another form of writing or storytelling or documentation. Even in deciding to make it a piece of theatre, it could have been a straight play. But I am a spoken word artist, so a big portion of my writing is poetic. And I'm a musical person, somebody who loves music, whose life is music, who, like, sometimes I genuinely feel like my life is a musical. So it made a lot of sense for me to write this as a spoken word musical. And then there's something else about the power of music or expressing oneself through music and through spoken word. I don't know if you watched the movie Sinners, right? But Delroy Lindo's character in that, I can't remember the name of the character, but there was a point where he was talking about some of the horrors of either slavery or Jim Crow. And it was so painful that it just turned into he was telling the story and then the pain lick and it just turned into and then music began, you know? So sometimes music is the only way to tell it. I realized, as I said before, that this story was bigger than me, right? But it wasn't just going to be an autobiography or what do you call it on the stage? Anyway, right? It wasn't going to be that because I was speaking to people through my experience and realizing that this was bigger than a me thing. And so the more I started speaking to other parents and carers, I realized that I wanted to integrate aspects of their stories in there and not just like stick verbatim to my individual experience. And it was through doing that kind of research that I realized that this wasn't going to be oneness. The character wasn't going to be oneness. Although she does have a similar name. And then, there's a part in the process where the shift from being the personal story into art simply happens. And you start to make choices about what remains private and what becomes part of the work. And you're balancing a few things because you are somebody who I spoke to when I was researching this project and when I was, looking at how am I going to do this, what I want to do, etc. I was speaking to this particular dramaturg and they were like making something that you would be comfortable with your child when he grows up seeing, and there are parts of the personal that you leave out because they're yours. And there are other parts that you're like, no, actually everybody can get something from this. And, but yeah, I think I didn't think too much about that, but of course, with everything, you want to protect your family, isn't it? And look after them. So it's a fine line because as an African Caribbean British woman, you don't put your business on the street. And here I am telling all of my business. But I think that when I've spoken to people in private, a lot of my business is similar to some of their business as well. So I think that, yes, there are specifics that are specific to my story, but there are things that, dare I say, belong to the community. So I combined my real experiences and some of the real experiences of families, like from the research, but I didn't use anybody's specific story and this is what happened to them on this date and like anything that would identify people. I think the research more informed like the themes and the types of stories, like lots of people had challenging times around diagnosis. So that gets to be an interweaving of all of our stories, even though a lot of it is based from mine. But you have that balance, right? Creative license. And as much as I have a kind of bigger why for why I'm doing this project, I want the world to be more inclusive. I want more understanding. I want to show stories that don't always get shown. My medium is like creativity, and I want to do something really creative. So therefore, in that is creative license to not kind of stick to anybody's particular story and keep everyone else, I guess, the community safe. I spoke about keeping my family safe, but the community was involved in this, so I also feel like keeping the community safe too. There are a few things that I deliberately removed, and some of that felt like the bits that weren't my story, the bits that were other people's business, or a few bits. I think I've told quite a raw story. Like I probably haven't removed that much in relation to the things that I want to talk about. Because if they don't get spoken about here, where do they get spoken about? So I didn't really take out that much. But I think whenever you're writing, and whenever you're writing from the space of a culture that of cultures or groups that are marginalized and don't get much screen time, I do think about what impression that I'm giving of an entire group if this is your first contact with it. However, I'm mindful, but I don't let that get in the way of the art. And then it's kind of different with, like, when you're working with adults or you're talking about your story and the story involves adults, I guess that, like, people get to choose what's part of it. Like, this is my story, but it wouldn't be my story without my son. It wouldn't be our story without the children. And so I try and sit in the authenticity and integrity of what it is that I'm talking about and my why. And I hope that, well, I don't know. I don't really have a hope. Even if I get bigger, when my son gets bigger and he turns around, it's like, Mum, why did you put this on the street? Why did you put this on the street? I can tell him why. So I sit in the integrity and trust that the work will do what the work is supposed to do. One of the gifts that I was given through this was being introduced to a community. I have the privilege of being part of a community. And so therefore this isn't just my story. And it was important that those who were kind of like supported me, paved the way, having their own experiences as peers, as friends alongside, that their feelings, not their feelings, their experiences fed into this. One of the things that happened during the research that really touched me is that there were mothers who have disabled children who are now not children anymore, they're adults. And they said no one ever asked them to talk about their experience. And I was like, yeah, that's why I'm asking, because it's important that your experience is shared. Like, how do we have some parts of society that we just don't know about and in turn end up designing a society that doesn't care? I'm not saying that everybody doesn't care, but I'm saying that when there's a lack of visibility and exposure, it doesn't, that community doesn't end up on the priority list and ends up having to fight things that they shouldn't be having to fight. I definitely think that doing the research changed or informed the direction of the play and what were the things that were important to talk about, and it had a big influence over the narrative structure, especially when I just kept seeing these reoccurring themes and reoccurring stories. It felt like, yeah, you can't not talk about that. I guess to reiterate what some of those themes were in not being understood, being tired, losing people, having to learn so much, being judged, their children being judged, fear of how their children would be treated when they're not around. And that's not around in the immediate, like dropping your child off somewhere for education or health or whatever. And also when you're actually not on the planet anymore to advocate for them. These are themes that we send parents and parents of children with disabilities in T21. These are some of the things that we think about and maybe think about at a different level to the average parent. Not saying that your parenting is average, but you know what I mean. I also learned how hard the system is making us then parents work. Everyone is constantly like got some mountain of paperwork that they need to deal with, be it educationally, be it you're homeschooling, be it you're trying to get an EHCP, be it that you're trying to get services, be it that your child needs something and you're being asked to prove that your child needs something. Like it's just relentless. Like the system could work a lot better and society could be more understanding. and not view it as a you issue and an us issue. You know what I mean? In March 2025, I did the first sharing of anything really publicly to do with this project. And by that point, I got to a point where I'd reworked some of the ideas and some of the poetry into poems and monologues. And I shared that, and I shared that quite in a conversational, closer to spoken word version of T21 Alchemy. And it was beautiful, but it was beautiful, not that I'm being modest or anything, but it felt good. However, me as Oneness did a lot of the explaining to link it all together. It was a bit more like in the genre of a stand-up comedy show where you tell your story. This is a clip from the scratch sharing at Certain Black's Afro Future Festival at Rich Mix, London. And so I told the people who it felt comfortable to tell. I didn't think the rest of the world would understand, but I had given birth to an X-Man. An extraordinary little man, well boy, actually, little prince. The X-Man thing, because I think we do have to be mindful of making ourselves and others superhuman, because people, it also has a shadow side where people think that superhumans don't have rights and etc. Right? But the X-Man thing for me was very real, because as I said, science and maths didn't get much of a look in, but where I learnt my science was from Marvel. So when I was being given his diagnosis, and they were like, 23, 21, chromosomes, an extra one. You mean extra genetic material? You mean like X-Men? And I was off. I was off. So they were still talking. And I'm going, oh my God. Oh yeah. Well, maybe would it be like more Magneto vibe? I was in a completely different space, right? And what it did for me, right? Obviously, I never thought my youth was Wolverine, right? Or Storm, right? But what it did was give me, whilst I was being told this doom and gloom story about what he wasn't potentially going to do and all the problems that there could be, I was in the space of possibility.
End of clip.
It was a bit more like in the genre of a stand-up comedy show where you tell your story. And at that point, it was still very much mine. And I knew that I wanted to expand things a bit more. I wanted to evolve the piece and evolve the story, because I wanted it to say more without me having to explain it. And as the narrative structure began to develop, I was like, no, hold on, this is 100% a play and not a collection of spoken word. The music was something that I wanted a space to explore, and that was a blessing that I got to do some of that in the R&D with rehearsal and development process with Christella Litras. I've worked with her before on other projects, and so I knew that she would be able to take me sending her a voice note going, I had this idea, whatever, and her be able to understand what I meant, what I was trying to do, and that we would be able to develop through that. Whilst at the same time, we didn't really have that much time in the studio because the R&D was relatively short, and I spent the majority of a big like the first portion of that time working with Matthew on staging and theatricality, etc. And so the music did get some time, but I would like more time with the music. Going back to where I was speaking about having to explain what the scenes, like what the pieces were about, what the poetry was about. For me, yes, it's great, it's conversational, but when you actually have scenes and more theatricality, you get to be a fly on the wall, and you get to like make your own sort of judgments, if you like, of what you're seeing means, as opposed to being told by me, the writer, what it means. And yeah, that fly on the wall thing is invaluable. I'm recording, darling. After, yeah. It's been a real blessing to develop my work in the way in which I've been developing it. So the first stage was my life and my lived experience and making little notes about my lived experience. The second phase was turning that into these separate pieces, which I was able to present at Certain Blacks Afro Future Festival back in 2025. So that was like the first part. That and crowdfunding was like the first part of the commission to get it there. And then the next phase, which was supported by the Arts Council, was to take that into being a full script, right? Which was like amazing. But a big part of that was the getting the audience feedback and an audience reactions to things and what worked, what didn't work, etc. I think that audiences that know the story, as in they have shared lived experience of the protagonist or the protagonist's child, relate to it in a way that they don't get to see their stories depicted in the world, right? And those who don't know the story and the world is new to them, that is also really a powerful piece, because they get to see a world that they didn't know about before.
You may have noticed the very real ending to that recording when my son came in, and basically that was my cue that this episode is over. And it's quite fitting because this project lives inside my real family life. At the moment, it isn't made in a studio separate from my parenting, it's made alongside it. So I had to wrap quickly, but I really do hope that this episode gave you some insight into how this work is being created and the thinking and lived experience underneath the play in the podcast. Thank you for listening and spending time with me. There's more to come in the other episodes, and I hope you'll stay with this journey.
T21 Alchemy.